For almost 12 years, I worked as a 911 dispatcher. 12 long years receiving all kinds of calls from people who think they are important to those who are really scared and asking for help for extreme situations. In all that time, I learned to keep the toughest calls in a corner of my mind, to put aside the pain I absorbed like a sponge. I have spent many sleepless nights, and there is one call that has never been erased from my mind. Among all of them, there is one that will always be there, present in my thoughts. I remember every detail because I have a copy of the transcript of that call, so I'm going to use it to tell you what happened. This is the story of a girl named Asha, a Jane Doe who, like so many others, was on the front lines in a desperate situation. We 911 dispatchers are the crucial link between people in danger and the emergency responders who arrive to help. Our job is to reduce response time and save lives. And that was the reason I decided to get into this. I was never very athletic, so a career in the police or military wasn't my thing. It's always bothered me a little bit, because ever since I was little I dreamed of making the world a better place. So when I found out I could be a 911 dispatcher, I didn't hesitate. I was told it wasn't a job for just anyone, that it was something that could seriously affect the mental health of those who did it. Sounds crazy, right? But that only made it more appealing. In the end, it was a public service, and even though I knew it would be difficult and sometimes depressing, I would be helping my fellow Americans in their darkest moments. In addition, being a police dispatcher requires specific training. It's not easy being a call operator or an emergency medical services dispatcher, but being a police dispatcher is even more complicated. We all knew that only the smartest and determined could do it, so I was over the moon when I passed the exam and was accepted into the training course. I was a seasoned dispatcher when I got the call from Ashland, just a few hours into my shift. He had returned from the break room with a cup of black coffee that promised to keep me up all night. I always said a little prayer to myself before I took each call, hoping it was nothing serious, nothing that would leave me scarred. But as soon as I heard the girl's voice, I knew something bad was coming. The screams are horrible because you can barely understand them. You spend the first few minutes trying to get them to breathe enough to talk, but the worst are the whispers. When someone calls out whispering, it's because they are in imminent danger. They whisper because they know that whatever is threatening them is very close. 911, what is your emergency address? I asked. The call had been transferred from a general operator, and as soon as I knew I needed the police, I got ready. I was right in front of a laundromat on 4th Street. There was silence before the girl told me she didn't know exactly where I was, and that answer gave me a chill. This is going to be complicated. What's going on? I tried to sound calm because young people usually respond better if you stay relaxed. But her voice was shaking and I knew something horrible was happening. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could only hope he could give me more details before everything got even scarier. The girl's voice sounded calm, almost too natural, and that terrified me. There wasn't a hint of hope in her tone. She was so close in the laundry room, but it didn't sound like there was going to be a rescue. "No, I'm in the bedroom with him," she blurted out, and those words echoed in my head like an echo. I was trapped. And the worst part was that it wasn't an isolated place, but a commercial and residential neighborhood. For a moment I tried to calm myself, thinking that this could be resolved without complications. "Do you know what color the house is?" I asked, trying to divert the topic a bit to get more details and keep her focused, but she just answered me with a no. That simple word gave me a bad feeling. Things were really bad. The police can't just go kicking in the door of every apartment near the 4th Street laundromat without a good reason. But before I could press her further, she spoke again. "Please hurry." I felt my heart racing. I knew I was in a desperate situation, perhaps in extreme danger, but I had to continue to keep my composure and assess what was going on. "Does he have a gun?" I asked, as I was already thinking of a warning to gather the necessary officers for a possible rescue. "He has a taser," she said, speaking quieter and quieter. But she seemed strangely calm despite the gravity of the situation. It made me think that maybe they had her sedated or under the effects of something. "Are you hurt?" I asked, worrying about her condition. "A little, I think," she replied in a voice that sounded like she was about to break, and that broke my soul. "Is there any way you can get out of the house without him seeing you?" I inquired. "I don't know, without waking him up. I'm scared," she told me, and I could tell she was shaking with terror. "Is there a bathroom in the house?" I asked again, and his voice cracked as he replied, "My bedroom door is closed and he made it so I would make noise if he came out." "Will he do something to you?" I had never felt so much tension on a call. "Yes, he tied me up," she said. "Are you tied up now?" I asked, although I expected her to say no. "A little, but I got loose, I think," she replied, and at that moment I thought she was truly brave. But suddenly she said, "I think I woke him up." Oh my God, I think I woke him up. My heart stopped when I heard that. The silence on the line was terrifying, and it was what seemed like whole minutes before I finally got up the nerve to say something. "Are you still there?" "I don't know how long I can hold on," he muttered. It was heartbreaking to hear her like this. "I know, but I have to keep you in line," I said, trying to reassure her as I immediately called the officers to come to the laundromat. Fortunately, there were only a couple of houses right across the street from the laundromat, and I really can't describe the feeling of relief I experienced when I finally heard the cops arrive. "Hands up! Right now!" they shouted as they entered the place. I held back tears of joy to know that this girl was finally safe, but joy soon turned to sadness as we learned that while searching the house, they found the bodies of 2 other missing women. The kidnapper, a guy named Paul Great, was arrested and later convicted of sexually abusing the 3 girls, including Asha, and murdering the other 2. During the trial, I heard him say that, although he had killed before, he had no intention of killing his last victim. Supposedly, he planned to marry her someday. That line chilled me to the bone. To think of what she would have gone through, trapped as the unwanted bride of a killer as cold and callous as that, was just heartbreaking. What haunts me is where this girl would be if she hadn't broken free of her bonds, if she hadn't found a phone and made that call for her own rescue on that fatal night. Her bravery was the only reason she managed to escape that horror and survive that monster. "911, please state your emergency." My voice was shaking and I could barely speak. My parents were in the same old, and this time I was convinced the situation was going to end very badly. I could hear my mom screaming in the background and my dad threatening her. The day had started out normal enough, but I wasn't expecting what was to come. I had been hiding in my closet because my dad came home drunk very early that morning. My mom went to open the door for him as usual, but all he got back was a slap in the face. At that moment, I was on the stairs, my heart in my fist. This horrible cycle of violence and abuse had been my life. For as long as I could remember, things had been this way. It wasn't until I went to a sleepover at a friend's house that I realized that what I was experiencing at home was not normal, that not all families were like that. I was 7 years old and an only child at the time. So when I saw what life was like at my friend's house, I began to realize how bad things were at home. By the time I turned 18, I had already planned to run away. I felt my mom was weak, always trembling at my dad's every whim, always helpless and scared. I hated that, and what's worse is that sometimes I looked too much like him. I hated seeing my brown hair and eyes because they reminded me so much of him, and my freckles irritated me even more. I remember one time my dad beat up my mom and she fell to the ground. At that moment, her eyes full of fear met mine and she said, "Alice, come here." She had beer stains on her shirt and her pants were untucked. At that instant, I turned and ran downstairs. I still have scars from those times when I didn't manage to escape in time or didn't see the blow coming. No one wondered why I wore long-sleeved clothes and a scarf even in summer. They probably thought it was a weird fashion choice, but the truth is, It was because I had taken criticism more than once. Because that was another thing, it never occurred to me to ask for help. I just felt embarrassed and tried to hide it in front of others, pretending I was just an ordinary girl with a normal family. But this time I had some money saved up, enough to live on my own for a while, and I thought about finding a job or something to do to make a living. I was finally of age, and that meant only one thing to me: freedom. That morning, I heard my dad's footsteps staggering behind me after slapping my mom in the door. I knew things were going to get ugly now for me, so I ran, looking to get to my room for shelter. "Wait!" my mom yelled, and as I looked back, I saw she was on the floor, trying to grab his leg as he dragged her with every step. She was always trying to stop him, bearing the brunt of the abuse but never getting anywhere. I remember once asking her why she didn't just leave, but she tearfully told me she had nowhere to go. Her parents were dead, and we were her only family. The image of my dad kicking my mom in the face, trying to get her to let go of his leg while I ran, haunts me to this day. I couldn't stop to look again. I just went up to my room, closed the door, and hid in the closet. Her screams were clearly audible even if I tried to sneak into a dark corner. I felt I could do nothing but stay there. However, this time I felt it was enough. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. "Please, what is your emergency?" the operator repeated. I choked up as I sobbed and couldn't see through my tears. The closet felt like a prison, and for an instant, I thought anxiety and fear were going to win me over. "He's going to kill us," I managed to say with my voice cracking and shaking. It was a desperate moment. At that moment, my mom screamed again for help, and I whispered, "Please hurry." Then I hung up and walked out of the closet with my knees shaking. I took a second to calm down, took a deep breath and went downstairs, but when I got to the living room, the scene was horrible. My mom had blood on her face and her blonde hair looked like a mess. My dad was standing over her, kicking her hard. I froze, unable to form coherent sentences, and at that moment our eyes met. She shook her head, trying to tell me I needed to run away, but despite the panic I felt, I held my dad's gaze. "I already called 911, I said, trying to control the trembling in my voice. "The police are on their way." In that instant, his dark eyes filled with rage, and I knew I had no choice but to run, but I froze in my tracks. In retrospect, I should have, but I couldn't. "You did it again!" I yelled at him, trying to stand my ground despite how scared I was. I could smell the stench of beer on his breath, but I tried not to be intimidated. My voice was shaking, but I kept repeating what I had said earlier. "The police are on their way," I blurted out. I took a step back, and even though my instincts told me I should run, I couldn't leave my mom with that monster, so I stayed, but my heart was pounding like crazy. Suddenly, I saw him grab something, and before I could calculate the situation, he raised his arm so quickly that I couldn't react in time. Then I felt something sharp scratch my face, and a scream came out of my throat as I felt the blood dripping down. He was holding a spiked belt, the kind that hurt on contact. Without giving me time to do anything, he grabbed me by the hair and dragged me towards where my mom was. He pushed me really hard, and we collided. "I'm going to teach you a lesson you'll never forget," he said, and his voice full of fury made my skin crawl. I looked down at his hand, still holding that belt, then thought, this can't end well. But I realized he was so drunk that maybe that would give us a chance to escape. "Mom, we have to get out of here," I said as I pushed her to stand up. She let out a groan and slowly stood up, holding onto her side as if she was having trouble moving. At that moment, the belt lifted again, and I pushed my mom out of the way just in time. She fell on top of me, and I cried out in pain as her weight made me stagger. "Run!" I shouted. His eyes were full of desperation, and we both felt the urgency to get out of that room. My dad threw a punch with the belt again, but I managed to dodge it. Then he stumbled and fell face first to the floor, at which time I took the opportunity to launch myself toward the door. By that time, my mom had already reached the exit, and I was following close behind. At that instant, I heard sirens approaching, and the police car pulled up right in front of us. The officers quickly got out, noting our bruised and bloody appearance, and instantly called an ambulance, reporting that our condition was critical. While my mom was being treated for bruised ribs, I got some stitches on my face and ice for the swelling. My dad didn't even put up a fight when they took him away. The testimony we gave against him was so strong that I knew they would put him away for a long time. And deep down I wished I would never see him again. After this nightmare, my mom joined a group that supported people who had suffered abuse. Little by little she got better, and I supported her with the money I had until I got my first job as a waitress. I had not imagined that my future could be like this. But now that I was free of my father and all his violence, now the future looked bright and everything seemed possible. I looked forward, knowing that all of this was thanks to that small act of courage that led me to make the 911 call. If you ask a police officer what time of year they're most afraid to work, chances are some will mention Christmas or Super Bowl day, which I understand. But I assure you most will give you that tired look before saying Halloween. For us, that date is a real challenge. In the small New England town where I work, the number of emergency calls spikes about 6 or 7 times higher on Halloween night. It's as if that day unleashes the worst in people. Sure, there are things we know are going to happen. Houses getting covered in eggs, trees decorated with toilet paper by bored teenagers looking for trouble, reports of drunken weirdos running around. Anyway, those calls are manageable. But what really complicates everything is that in the midst of all this fuss, we get sent to fewer officers, which means we're in serious trouble if something serious breaks out. What I've faced over the years with Halloween nonsense pales in comparison to what happened at the house at the end of Madison Street. That night stuck in my mind forever, and not for a positive reason. It all started when I responded to a call about a group of teenagers who were trick-or-treating in a very aggressive manner. And what's worse, they weren't wearing costumes. That's precisely what bothers me about Halloween. It wasn't technically illegal, but I don't need a group of troubled youths walking around on a night like that, especially with hundreds of excited kids roaming around looking for treats. I made my attempt to lecture them, receiving looks of disdain in return, but decided to let it go. As an officer, I've been involved in car chases with criminals, shootouts, and all kinds of crazy situations, so arguing with a bunch of kids who just want to cause trouble isn't exactly what I want to deal with. As I was walking back to my patrol car, the radio immediately came on. My dispatcher, with his usual sense of humor, mentioned something about that dilapidated house in Madison. He told me they had received another call about the Halloween decorations there, which looked too scary. This was the third call of the day on that subject, so he suggested I take a look at it if I had a little time to spare. We both had a bit of a laugh about it. You know, it's common for us to get absurd calls on Halloween. Besides the kids, there are also bitter old men who just can't stand to see others having fun. For example, there's a Christian woman who calls us every year about the same thing. The kids are trespassing on her property while trick-or-treating. I really don't understand why she takes it so seriously. Still, I go about my duties, responding to the calls and staying alert. A couple of hours passed. The evening turned dark, and the young children, accompanied by their dads, began to return home. Only a few groups of teenagers were left, heading to parties or to some nightclub. Then the dispatcher mentioned the house in Madison to me again. She told me that she had had several more calls about these decorations that were scaring children and parents alike at that location, and asked me to go around and check it out. The idea of confronting some hermit who is obsessed with horror movies and is about to lecture me about Halloween and his right to decorate however he wants didn't thrill me at all. Nor did having to lecture him about morality and respecting neighbors and blah blah blah. It was just what I needed to make me feel like the protector of innocence as the cold Halloween wind blew. Sometimes I feel like I'm the world's grumpy stepdad. I really do. So I get in my patrol car and head to that part of town that's a little more run down. When I got to Madison, I saw the house right away. I couldn't miss it. It was an old colonial that was covered in Halloween decorations. There were vampire and zombie cardboards everywhere, fake cobwebs decorating the porch, and I counted a couple dozen carved pumpkins scattered around the lawn with some pretty elaborate designs. But what really gave me the creeps was something hanging from a large oak tree on the side of the house. That was the most disturbing Halloween decoration I had ever seen. It wasn't disturbing because it looked too real. The limbs were too stiff and the hair looked super fake. However, how things were positioned made my hair stand on end as I watched from my patrol car. The figure was hanging by its neck on one of the thick branches of the tree, swaying gently in the autumn breeze. Look, I'm a cop and I've seen weird things in my job, so I don't scare easily. On the contrary, I'm quite logical and rational, but that figure sent a shiver down my spine. It really looked like a real hanged man. I got out of the car, keeping my eyes fixed on the decoration as I walked towards it. The leaves crunched under my feet with every step I took, and I reached for the flashlight on my belt to focus the light on the tree. Then I realized the reason people were so alarmed. The texture of the thing's skin was very graphic, blotchy and a shade of purple, almost as if it were a real corpse. I felt a little silly for feeling so disturbed by a simple, well-crafted Halloween decoration. But then a metallic, nauseating smell hit me, mingling with what I had assumed was a gaudy decoration. At that moment, I knew it wasn't a joke. This was a real corpse. It had been hanging there all day, and dozens of kids had walked by it without noticing. My stomach churned horribly, and I ran back to my patrol car, radioing for the coroner to be sent out as quickly as possible. My dispatcher nearly fainted when I told her what I had found, horrified that people had been staring at a dead body all day. It turned out that the hanging guy was one Ernest Brown, a retired teacher who, investigators told me, had been duped by disreputable people posing as an underage girl. They had threatened him with going public with some of the more disgusting things he said online, and he decided to take the easy way out. He hung himself from a tree without thinking about what might happen to his body. People make me feel bad for not enjoying Halloween and laugh at me when I am skeptical about this holiday. They usually talk about how much fun they're going to have or what costume they are going to wear, but they have no idea about the dark things that sometimes happen on that night. The things that are hiding in plain sight. Sometimes I think that if they knew what was really going on in the streets on that night, they wouldn't be so quick to go out and celebrate. I was about 18 years old when it all happened. It's a weird story, and to be honest, I don't really know how to explain it. I just know that the world is a lot stranger than it seems. At the time, I was living with my parents, but at this specific time, they were on vacation for a month, so for a few days, I had the house all to myself. And like any other teenager alone at home, I called some friends and we got together to play ping pong in the basement or video games in the living room. One night, after one of those sessions with my friends, I received a call. The number was not saved in my contact list, but I decided to answer. At first, all I could hear was static, and I thought it was a prank by the guys, and they were trying to pull one of their pranks on me, so I put the call on speakerphone so the others could hear it. And then, all you could hear was this deafening noise. After a couple of minutes, I hung up, but then again, the phone rang. I answered again, and guess what? Same story, just static. Although this time I thought I heard a woman's voice mumbling something. I couldn't catch what it said, so I hung up again. That was the last time I was called that night. The next day I went through my usual routine, but my friends were busy, so I spent the day alone and didn't feel like going out. When evening came, I made myself some dinner, and suddenly my phone rang once again. The number was not on my list, so I answered it, and again the same static tortured my ears. Suddenly I heard a woman's voice clearly, "Help, I think he's dead, help!" And then it cut off. I was stunned. It was kind of weird, but I thought maybe it was another joke, so I decided not to make a big deal out of it. However, that became a kind of daily routine. I would get the call, and little by little the woman would say more things. Every day, her words became more disturbing. On the last day before my parents returned home, I received another call. This time, I was really intrigued. I was curious about what the teaser would say this time, and that last call was the longest of all. The woman was shouting, "Help! I think he's dead, help! The floor is covered with blood. I didn't mean to do it, you know." He hit me, so I hit him back. That's when he pulled out a knife and stuck it in my arm, she said. I shuddered just remembering. Then she continued. He was drunk and lost his balance, slipped in a puddle of soapy water on the floor because he was washing dishes. When he fell, the knife went into his stomach. Help! Was that a 911 call? The woman began to cry, and just before the call cut off, I heard the pain in her voice. I didn't know if it was real or not, but at the time it seemed too strange to ignore. I recorded the conversation because I found it interesting. Then I kept thinking about what the woman was saying. Maybe it was some kind of horror story I could find online, but it seemed too concrete to be just a fabrication. So I sat down at my laptop and started searching for keywords like knife-wielding killer woman or death in the kitchen. I found a bunch of articles about women killing their husbands with knives, and that shocked me. I kept reading until I found one that mentioned a woman right in my hometown. It turns out that this woman used to live on the same block as me about 20 years ago. My family moved into this neighborhood right around the time I was born, and after doing a little more research, I found out that she had been in the house my parents bought. The girl, her name was Anna Simpson, and she had murdered her husband in cold blood. That was what the neighbors whispered, although she always said it wasn't her fault, but no one believed her. She was sentenced to life imprisonment just outside the city. Every time I read more about his case, I realized that he had made a statement that exactly matched what I heard on the phone recording. He was drunk and fell down that night. But of course, the cop didn't believe him and thought he was just trying to save his own skin. He tried to get the authorities to retrieve the recording of his 911 call, but was told it didn't exist. As far as the police were concerned, she had never called. Mary insisted that she had and that her call had been answered, but that no one answered. That story intrigued me so much that I decided to go to the prison to talk to her. I needed to tell her what I had heard and the similarities to her statement. Maybe I could help her in some way. I know it sounds weird, but I've always been interested in theories about parallel realities and crossed paths and stuff. Besides, I had the recording, and maybe she could use it to prove her innocence. I arrived at the prison and told a guard that I wanted to see Anna Simpson. Before I could explain further, I was interrupted by the guard who asked, "Do you know Anna?" I replied that no, I just wanted to talk to her. But then he looked up from his file and told me that Anna had died the night before. I froze. "What happened?" I asked, crossing my arms so my nervousness wouldn't show. She told me that she had been screaming all night, claiming she was innocent and threatening suicide on several occasions. At first they checked her out, but when they saw she was fine, they ignored her. She mentioned a 911 call and how she was going to prove her innocence. The guard simply shrugged and said, "Sorry, Anna," as he walked away. Eventually, she made good on her threat and took her own life. I froze, paralyzed for a few minutes, but as I turned to leave, a woman approached me. "I'm sorry. Did you say you knew Anna Simpson?" She asked me, her eyes filled with tears. I then began to tell her about the call with the recording and everything I had found. The woman confirmed, "Yes, that's her voice," and burst into tears. She asked me. She wanted to be heard. She didn't want to be remembered as a murderer. The craziest thing about all this is that I received those calls by mistake. It turned out that the inmate had the wrong number. I don't know how they came across the recording, but all I can say is that I regretted not having arrived a day earlier. My name is Susanna, and I have worked as a 911 dispatcher for 20 long years. And believe me, it's been a roller coaster. The pay is pretty good, about $22 an hour, which is not bad at all for someone like me who started practically from scratch. I needed nothing more than my high school diploma and to be ready to hear some of the most disturbing things you can imagine. The first two parts were easy, but the third part, that is dealing with extreme situations, that was a whole different story. At first, I thought there were a lot of trivial calls. Sometimes it was just someone wanting to report a barking dog or a group of teenagers fooling around, but other times it was serious. Imagine getting a call saying a guy is robbing a house with an axe. Those experiences created kind of a mix of emotions in me. You'd never want to get an emergency call about a real attack, but sometimes the reality was even stranger. A kid getting electrocuted from sticking a fork in an electrical socket. There were several of those too. So in the midst of the craziness of the calls, I learned to differentiate the serious from the trivial. More than half of the calls were legitimate. Accidents, medical emergencies, some real crime. Then there was another segment, maybe 40%, that were just misunderstandings, confused people, or, what they would say today, people with diminished capacity. And less than 10% were those things that truly kept me awake at night, even if I tried to anesthetize myself with vodka and sleeping pills. I don't want to bore you with the horrendous things I heard. Sometimes they seemed more like horror comedies than anything else. But there is one case in particular that I keep to myself whenever someone asks me about the worst call I've ever received. And here it goes. One cloudy Saturday, I received a call that popped up on my screen. I answered it with my classic 911 phrase, "What's your emergency?" But this time, on the other end, there was only silence. We typically receive more accidental calls than one might imagine. Before smartphones came along, we had those phones that dialed 911 accidentally. So there I was, repeating my usual greeting, hoping it wasn't another dumb call, but before I could hang up, I heard a little voice on the other end of the line. I couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl, but it sounded very small, maybe 4 or 5 years old. "Hello," he whispered in a voice so sweet it made me change my tone immediately. "Hello, little one. I'm Susanna. Is everything okay?" The voice was shaking with fright, but the child seemed to be trying to calm down. "Did I make a call to 911? She asked timidly. "Yes, you did very well, little one. Can you give me the phone to Mom or Dad, please?" As the conversation progressed, I tried to remain calm. Then the child's voice changed a little and he said, "Mommy fell down." I paused, hoping I had misunderstood. "She fell? Is she okay?" But then, the child repeated, "She can't get up." At that moment, I didn't want to imagine what was happening, but I knew I had to do it to help. I began to form a picture in my mind of what might be happening, and I have to admit I felt sick. That innocent voice was describing something terrible. The child continued, talking about Mommy's eye that had fallen out. The innocence in his voice contrasted with the horror of the situation, and it hit me like a brick. Although I have received more violent calls and heard life snuffed out on the line, nothing affected me as much as that little being, traumatized and lost in his own reality, talking about what could be his deceased mother. "Honey, do you know where you live?" I asked the little guy. It was a long one to have a chance to trace the call and get her street name, so I started dialing the police without wasting any time. We had to get her out of what she was seeing as soon as possible. "Yes," she replied, "I live at home." Tracing the call took only a few seconds. While keeping the child on the line, I directed the nearest patrol car to her location. "Do you know what happened to your mommy?" I asked, each word a struggle against the terror that swept over me. My biggest fear was that there was someone there in the house ready to hurt the little boy. The child's shaky voice continued, "Mommy and Daddy were screaming." "Okay, sweetie, I need you to stop looking at Mommy. Can you do that for me?" I tried to sound calm. "Yes," she replied. "I want to look at Olaf," she mentioned, and I knew she was talking about the snowman from Frozen. "Perfect. I want you to stay on the phone and look at Olaf," I told her, as I tried to keep her mind busy and off the horrifying situation. "Describe Olaf for me. What does he do?" So I continued, asking question after question about what I was seeing. I was talking to him until I finally heard the policeman arrive on the scene. They rushed in because apparently the door was open. It turned out that it was a girl and she was only 4 years old. Her name was Rebecca, and she was taken to children's services and would now enter the adoption system. I hoped she would find a family that would love her and give her the stability she needed. Later, I learned that the father had never been present in the girl's life. The reality was that the guy who had beaten her mother to death with a baseball bat was her current boyfriend, a guy with a history of drug problems and violence. It all happened over a petty claim, and after murdering her, he tried to flee the state to evade justice. But as is often the case, luck was not on his side. A broken taillight led him to a routine traffic stop. The officer noticed the guy was too nervous, so upon checking his car, he found the bloody bat in the trunk. I'm not gonna lie, this one doesn't rank as the worst call I've ever received in my job. There are some that still give me nightmares at night years later. But this is the only one I feel a little comfortable talking about, maybe because there's a glimmer of hope at the end. The little girl was adopted by a loving couple who were looking for someone like her. At least that part of the story has a happy ending, and that comforts me. Being an emergency dispatcher was my life for 11 years, right up until Hurricane Katrina hit. It all started one summer before my junior year of high school. I had decided to get into law enforcement after shadowing the police department a couple of times. I imagined things would be like in the movies, full of high-speed chases and sirens blaring everywhere. But seeing what they actually did during patrols changed my perspective dramatically. It wasn't just about being the cool kid with a badge and a gun. It was about connecting with the community. Cops knew people by name, helped the elderly carry groceries, and kept kids out of trouble. They were making a real difference. They weren't just two guys shooting for fun. So, on weekends and some summers, I started working part-time on the radio. Eventually, I got a full-time position after graduating high school. Even though it was not illegal for a minor under 18 to be in a dispatch center, I could not take 911 calls without an APCO-certified operator with me. For those who don't know, APCO stands for Association of Public Safety Communications Officials and is the standard in the United States, where everyone must get their certification to work in dispatch centers. I could run the fire and medical emergency console, but it was absolutely illegal for me to handle information from the National NCIC crime system without the certification. That was just one of the many rules I couldn't get around until I turned 18. So I spent my days helping out at Mobile County Fire and Medical Dispatch while I waited to turn of age to receive my certification. Plus, I was a volunteer firefighter in my spare time, which is a bit risky and not entirely common around here, but that's another story. On that fateful day, the same day Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, I was on duty as a 911 operator in Mobile, Alabama. I received a flood of calls from New Orleans and the Mississippi coast. I guess we started getting them because the 911 centers to the west were collapsing. One of the calls I distinctly remember was a woman screaming that she was trapped in her home on Gordon Street between Florida and Law. I had a hard time understanding it at first because we also have a street called Florida here. But after checking and not finding it, I asked her what city she was calling from. And she replied that she was calling from New Orleans. Hearing that made my heart sink, of course. The water had completely flooded the first floor of his house and was still rising. I asked her if she could find a way out, if there were windows on the second floor through which she could escape. But no, she told me she only had a small one-story house with an attic. I tried to contact 911 and the New Orleans Fire Department, but the lines were jammed. It was total chaos. Calls from New Orleans and the coastal areas were flooding dispatch centers across the country. Every time I managed to make my way through to reach some unit, I heard silence, lines down from the ferocity of the hurricane. I tried to stay calm as I talked to her, focused on her friends, her family, the life she had before the storm washed everything away. She seemed to be a well-liked woman, but she was distraught for her older relatives, especially because she knew they were even more helpless than she was at that moment. Her concern and vulnerability came through on the phone, and I wondered if there was anything I could do to help her. I will never forget the generosity that woman showed. even in such a desperate situation. When she told me that the water was up to her waist, I suggested that she go up to the attic and take some food and water to hold her over. She joked that she could empty the fridge and take everything up to the attic, even finish the leftovers from the night before. She was an incredibly strong woman. It amazed me how the human spirit can shine through even in the darkest of times. However, over time, I noticed that her voice was beginning to tremble. Her breathing was getting faster, and suddenly she told me that water was starting to seep into the attic through the floor. I couldn't believe it. I never thought water would rise that high. My heart sank as I realized that this situation was much more serious than I had imagined. With no way out and the water rising, I asked her if there was a window in the attic through which I could get out. She replied that there was not, and at that moment, panic began to take hold of me. I was trapped in an enclosed space, and the water was still rising. In desperation, I told her to find something heavy, something she could use to break the ceiling or a fan to escape. I heard her cursing and moaning as she tried to use an object I couldn't identify to get out. The knocking became weaker and less frequent each time. Finally, she returned to the phone in a voice full of terror. "I can't do it. I can't get through the vent either. What am I going to do?" she screamed, the panic palpable. The water was already up to her waist and still rising. My heart was breaking to hear her voice crack as tears began to well up in her eyes. "I'm going to stay on the line with you as long as you need," I told her, trying to calm her down. So I stayed that way, listening as she cried, prayed, and cursed. Then I began to hear her struggle to keep her head and the phone out of the water. Suddenly, the call was cut off. To this day, I don't know if she survived or not, but judging by the situation she was in, almost certainly not, and the thought of that breaks my heart. I quit my job at the dispatch center about 4 months after Katrina. I signed up for therapy sessions at an office in downtown Mobile, seeking help dealing with the most traumatic calls I had ever handled. To my surprise, the therapist, who specialized in police officers and dispatchers, told me he thought I should quit my job. He explained to me that people have a limited capacity to withstand trauma. Maybe I had reached my limit, but I don't regret being on the phone with that poor woman in New Orleans. If I had it to do over again, I would do it in a heartbeat. The human connection I felt, though tragic, was worth it, and I'm sure my accompaniment made her last moments less painful and heartbreaking. Sometimes just being there for someone at their worst can mean everything, and that is something I will never forget. I can't forget how altruistic that girl turned out to be, especially working on the medical side of a 911 dispatch center. Since smartphones became more advanced, I've heard that locating someone is much easier. There's a new system in the UK that uses 3 words to locate EMTs right where you are, which would be amazing in emergency situations. Rumor has it that they will implement something like this in several states, but back in 2005, when there were only flip phones, finding the precise location of an injured person was a real challenge. As I understand it today, you can get your location from just a few feet away. But in the early 2000s, you had to deal with whole square mile areas, maybe a county, but nothing like the technology they have now. So with that little bit of context, I count this was, without a doubt, the worst 911 call I've ever received. I received a call from a cell phone, presumably one of those flip phones, and it was a girl younger than me telling me that her mom had fallen and wouldn't wake up. As I asked her questions, it became clear that her mother had not only fallen, but had passed out on a flight of wooden stairs. From her tone, it sounded like there were no vital signs, although I knew it was possible that the girl didn't know what to look for. What really scared me was that the little girl couldn't give us a clear direction, so I asked all sorts of things, like if there was any mail nearby that she could read, but nothing. She was panicking, and in a situation where every second counted, we were running out of time. The only information he would give me was that they lived on a farm. Since almost all of my district was rural, this did not get us any closer to saving his mom. Through a series of basic questions, I asked him how long it had been since his mom fell, and he told me it had happened right after his favorite TV show started. As I did the math, I realized that his mother had been unconscious for at least 30 minutes. In those situations, we are taught to stay calm and be as professional as possible. A trainer had told me that being as robotic as possible helps save lives by keeping emotional distance. But hearing that Mom had been like this for half an hour made me feel like a block of ice was gripping my chest. It was an incredible challenge to stay focused. So I took a deep breath and tried to apply the techniques I had been taught. So I asked him the name of the street, if there were any landmarks or what I could see from the entrance, but all he could tell me was that his family walked to church every Sunday. That didn't help much. A few minutes later, my supervisor was taking a look at a map of our area, where we marked all the churches near the farm. After narrowing it down to about 5 possibilities, we sent a unit to each church. I instructed them all to turn on their lights and sirens so this girl could hear the vehicles approaching. This would be key to better coordinate the response. But you have to think that there we only had 3 fire trucks, 2 ambulances, and 4 police cruisers to cover the entire area. So finding this girl's location meant we were risking the lives of others just to save one. The tension became unbearable, but good news came when some sheriff's deputies and some highway patrol officers offered their assistance. In just 15 minutes from the call, I had never witnessed such a quick and large response in our area. I remember noticing the timing because that's when I discovered that the phone she was using was cordless and that her family had left the phone right at the bottom of the stairs near the front door. That meant she could go outside, look for lights, and listen for sirens. It was a crucial breakthrough in finding her. The suspense grew even more when it seemed that the little girl could not open the front door. But in a moment of true joy, I heard her shout, "That's it, I opened it." Then I just had to cross my fingers and hope I heard the sirens in time. I know that sounds cliche, but in life and death situations, those little hopes feel like big miracles. The minutes seemed like an eternity, and I never really understood the concept of elastic time until that moment. When the girl finally heard our sirens, it felt like hours had passed. But there was no time to celebrate because now we had to figure out which of the emergency vehicles could arrive first. Thinking quickly, a colleague asked me to tell each of them to turn off their sirens. One by one, we asked them to turn them back on to find out which one was closest. It turned out to be one of the fire trucks, so we sent them all back to their positions, and then they dispersed, sirens blaring again. Finally, a state officer pulled into her street, and the little girl could see him coming. "Run for the fire truck, honey," I shouted to her as we happily broke into silent applause knowing they were on their way. The tension eased a bit. There was a sense of relief in the air, and most of us expressed our happiness by simply punching the air or burying our heads in our hands. When the girl finally met the truck, the driver was able to communicate with us and confirm her location. His job was essentially done. I stayed on the line while the paramedics headed to the house. Then we said our goodbyes, and all that was left was the moment of waiting, hoping Mom was okay. By that time, Mom had been out for almost an hour and the anguish was palpable. But we learned later that she woke up and was incredibly disoriented. We knew there was something very wrong, but at least she was alive. It turns out she suffered a broken back, a truly horrific injury that would require more than a year of recovery. The police decided to give the girl a small reward as recognition for her bravery during the call, for staying calm and doing what we asked her to do. I don't know if that meant much, but what else could we do? In the end, this event had a positive outcome. Although the mother went through a complicated and painful recovery process, she suffered no brain or nerve damage. The reason I'm sharing all of this is to highlight something I consider super important. As an emergency dispatcher, I can say firsthand that parents need to teach their children a few essentials. First, they need to know their first and last name. Second, memorize their home phone number. Third, how to make a 911 call. And most importantly, fourth, they need to learn their complete home address and zip code. I've lost count how many times this basic information could have saved lives or at least prevented serious harm. So please don't just think about saving 911 operators some stress. This really is a key element in saving lives. Find creative ways to teach them. Make it a game, sing a song together. Whatever works for you. Teach your children how to call the police or an ambulance. It's critical and could make the difference between life and death.